Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Stephen Hubble from the Open Society Fellowship Program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Revising Paul Kagame. For years, George Soros has written about the lack of correspondence between perception and reality in financial markets and the consequences of that lack of correspondence for market behavior. Those consequences may or may not be salutary, but they're a fact of economic life. And Soros argues that it's difficult to understand market behavior without contending with that gap between perception and reality. One way to look at our task tonight is to ask whether there is a similar corresponding lack of correspondence between reality and perception in the life and career of Paul Kagame, who has been president of Rwanda since 2000. And if so, what the implications of that lack of correspondence might be for the work being done for human rights and for justice, international justice in the Great Lakes region, and in fact throughout Africa. We have assembled a distinguished panel here tonight whose job it will be to make that call. So welcome to journalist and editor Stephen Smith, Open Society fellow Howard French, Dr. Théogène Rudasingwa, and an especially warm thanks to Rona Pillegal, who's the deputy director of the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, who has kindly agreed to act as moderator. From the inception of this event, we also sought to include a panelist who would offer a contrasting perspective, a contrasting portrait of Paul Kagame. And we're very fortunate to have Tim Gallimore, who is former chief spokesman for the prosecutor of the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, to serve as respondent. So once the panel discussion has concluded, Tim will be given 5 to 10 minutes up here to pose questions and follow-up questions and remarks to the panel. After that, we'll open it up to Q&A, and at that point, our friends at Fora TV who are videotaping this have asked that we're going to hand around the microphone. So please wait for the microphone to arrive, speak into the microphone, and when it comes time to ask your question. Lastly, Fora TV will be videotaping this event for podcast down the line. That podcast will live on the Fora TV website, it'll live on the Open Society Foundation's website. By participating in this event, you are giving your tacit consent to be photographed, to be videotaped for that podcast, for that videocast. And without further ado, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Rona for moderating, and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good, thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for coming for what I think will be a very interesting conversation, and thank you to the panelists. Just to reintroduce them in case you didn't catch it the first time, we have Stephen Smith, who is a former Africa editor for Libération and Le Monde and is currently teaching at Duke University. We have Howard French, who is a former New York Times reporter who covered the genocide and its aftermath. And we have Dr. Théogène Rudasingwa, the former Secretary General of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and myself as Deputy Africa Director for Human Rights Watch, which covers human rights abuses in 80 countries worldwide and in Africa in about 18 different countries, one of which is Rwanda. And then, as mentioned, we have Tim Gallimore as a first responder who will be speaking after we have a brief conversation, which is oriented around several big questions about the role and legacy of Paul Kagame. We're going to be very informal. I'm going to pose some questions to the panelists. Everybody's going to be civil. We're all going to let each other speak. I'm going to reserve the liberty to cut people off if we need to, or if we're running low on time, and just ask you to wait patiently if you do want to say something when we get to the Q&A, and signal your intention to speak by raising your hand. So the first question that I would like to pose to the panelists, if okay with all of you, is How would you describe the new Rwanda, particularly under President Kagame, and whether you see Rwanda now as a continuation of pre-colonial and colonial practice, or something that represents a rupture from the genocide or post-genocidal period?
Wow.
You want to take that, Steve?
Well, yes. Maybe one thing one could say, and that will also lead to the question of continuity or rupture, is that it is a transformative authoritarian regime. I understand by this that the intent is not in any way to carry on or foster incremental change, but it is about a wholesome transformation of the Rwandan society and state. We will probably have occasions to speak about that in more detail. What I would add to is almost self-evident. In the shade of the 1994 genocide, transformative authoritarianism takes on a very specific kind. And secondly, I would add as another characteristic that it is sponsored by the international community. One of the basic facts is that 50% of the government budget comes from aid funds, mainly Great Britain, the United States, and so on and so forth, or European Nordic countries. So you have a international community-sponsored transformative authoritarian regime in the aftermath of genocide. Genocide, 800,000, 1 million people killed in 1994 within 100 days. This is, I think, for me at least, the core. And then you could argue that probably after the Tutsi domination under colonial rule, the Rwandan regime, post-independence regime, first under a president who lasted until 73, and then Habyarimana, leading to the genocide, was also transformative authoritarianism of a different way, but it was moving away from the colonial and pre-colonial past, and that you actually have lines of continuity that go through huge state capacity, control, nothing to do with the cliche of the feckless African state. So we can develop these characteristics, but you also have obviously ruptures. I think after genocide, nothing could be possibly, even though there was mass violence prior to that, nothing will be the same after the 1994 genocide. That's for our generation, together with the end of apartheid in South Africa, probably the watershed, and specifically, obviously, for the Great Lakes region, that is the main event. I will leave it like that for the moment.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to probe that for a second. I'm wondering if you can explain for us what you mean by transformative authoritarianism and what you mean by the legacy of control, what role you feel like that plays in contemporary Rwanda.
Very short, I'll just give you two examples. When the idea is to entirely transform the society, you would have an economic agenda that is set for 2015, turn a country that is the country of the thousand hills with 70%, 80% still rural, mostly subsistence peasants. You would turn that in, I quote, the Singapore of Africa, based on communication and technology. So you would turn it around entirely economically. We're right in the middle of that, or actually going forth. You turn the country around from a Rwandaphone, Kinyarwanda country with one official language that was predominant, French. In that instance, spoken as a real language, inhabited by people by 5%, but that was an elite. And you turn it around within 2 years, teaching language becomes English. Now, obviously, we all like that because we're English-speaking, but it's a little bit like the French when they rejoiced when Nigeria under dictatorship adopted French as the second language. Just think, as parents, if you had to school your child in schools where the teacher just started learning English 2 years ago and is now teaching in kitchen English to your children, it's not only a problem for the Francophone elite, it's also a problem for the English-speaking people who mostly send their children abroad, usually to Uganda. If you're the president, you may send them to the United States and school them elsewhere. So you have, when I speak about transformation, it's wholesome transformation. It's really root and branch. It's very total as a project, and you could go through different aspects of that transformation, economic, political, and as you can see, cultural, and how that plays out and what political consequences that has. But I think this is foreshadowing our conversation.
Howard and Theo, do you have comments on that or anything you'd like to add?
I would add that there's a couple of continuities that Stephen either didn't address or didn't stress enough. One of the in the latter category of having not stressed enough is that there's a very important ethnic characteristic to the state in Rwanda, to power in Rwanda, and that this is a continuity that, along with all the other continuities that Stephen addressed, has been with Rwanda throughout its history, although the polarities have changed from time to time, often with disastrous results. The other continuity which exists is that outside sponsorship of Rwandan authoritarianism is not a new thing at all. Rwandan authoritarianism, the midwife of Rwandan authoritarianism was outside sponsorship, and it has been a consistent factor throughout Rwanda's political history, although again the polarities have changed from time to time, and again with disastrous consequences. So I just would I don't wish to go on too long, but I think those are two other very important continuities that need to be looked at.
Theo, did you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, I would probably pick from where Howard left. For those in the audience who might not be very familiar with the history of Rwanda, which I'm not going to do because it would take us
a long time.
But in very few sentences, as you know, Rwanda is quite an ancient nation whose existence spans centuries. I very often say that Rwanda is much, much older than the United States, and many people say that's
Thank
not.
you.
That's not exactly, because most of countries are older than the United States. But for the most of its existence, Rwanda was governed by a small, because it was a kingdom, it was run by a king, and so it was run by a small elite, and particularly Tutsi elite. And that's, I think, one of the things that Howard was highlighting. It was also colonized by the Germans for a brief period of time, up to the end of the First World War, and then the Belgians came in, and then they governed Rwanda until its independence in 1962. But in 1959, there was a very violent revolution that not only overthrew the monarchy, but which also marked at the end of that period the end of the colonial era. And at that point, the colonial authorities who had thrown their weight behind the Tutsi aristocracy decided actually to create a Hutu elite to whom they left the instruments of power in 1962. And these, of course, existed until 1994, although there were two presidents, one until 1973, and the late president until 1994. And so the point I want to stress here, which we need to really understand, is that whereas there has been succession from the Tutsi kings to the colonial authorities to a Hutu elite until 1994, and then to another Tutsi elite since 1994 up to date, whereas there's been this succession, the structure of power has not changed. And if you don't understand this lesson about Rwanda, and first and foremost, sometimes we Rwandans find it very, very difficult to accept that, because the structure of the state has always had an ethnic characteristic. As I said, for centuries it was Tutsi, 1959 to 1994 it was Hutu, it has swung back to the Tutsi elite. And so both the Rwandans, depending on where you stand in that dynamic, sometimes it's very difficult to accept that kind of reality, because I always say when we come to a discussion like this one, I always look at the crowd and I can see deep anxiety. I can read your faces. Why? Because any discussion about Rwanda elicits very deep anxiety. And it does elicit very strong passions on both sides. Those who are for it, those who are against it. And that is how even the foreigners have become trapped into this conversation. either for or against. And so I think one of the greatest challenges that we have really as Rwandans is, can we figure out how to reconfigure power in Rwanda so that the Hutus and Tutsis, whom, as you've read books and books and books, have already, so these guys have hated each other for centuries. And sometimes people will tell you they're irreconcilable. The current government in Rwanda says it has reconciled Rwandans. It was like the guy who wrote The End of History.
Fukuyama.
Yes, the greatest American guy, Fukuyama, he says this is the end of history. There's nowhere else to go. And sometimes you hear this kind of conversation in Rwanda. So I think the greatest way to understand Rwanda today is that whereas there has been succession, and needless to say, the current government of Rwanda has done a lot of good things. But it is not the only one, and it is not the last one, because the previous one, of President Habyarimana, if you read anything about Rwanda up to the eve of the civil war in 1989, Rwanda received high marks for, depending on outside aid and delivering services to the people. It was the same with the previous government. So whereas the current government in Rwanda would score marks and receive probably an A or a B plus, if I'm modest, it does not score any better than previous governments in terms of restructuring power, in which the state can become an instrument of serving both Hutus and Tutsis, and especially of restructuring society in a way that both Hutus and Tutsis can feel that this is where they belong, this is their country, and they will die or live together in this kind of country. So that's all I can say at this point.
I'd like to ask further about that too, Jen. I'd like to know, what does it mean, whom does the RPF represent, do you think, in contemporary Rwanda, and what are the politics of exclusion now? Especially given the fact that one is not permitted, essentially, to speak about ethnicity in Rwanda.
That's a very good question. And by the way, as many people know, I was the General Secretary of RPF from 93 to 96. And if there's anybody who could comment on a relationship, especially on revising Kagame, Kagame was a colleague. I worked with Kagame very closely. I was intensely very loyal, actually to Kagame to the point of self-denial. And I would say that many people feel the same way about the kind of politics that RPF espoused because we believed in them. I was one of those people, if somebody had met me before I became estranged from the regime, and we had met sometime in, say, 1994, 96 or before, I always got irritated about anybody who told me that there are Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. I had bought into this whole philosophy of RPF that said, you know, we are all Rwandans, and so anybody who tries to bring out this whole issue of Hutu-Tutsi is actually a divisionist. I used to subscribe to that kind of notion. So you need to understand this, where RPF came from, because it began as an organization predominantly of Tutsi refugees in exile, especially our generation were people who had been born or had gone into exile, very young people, and who had grown up in exile in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Congo, in Burundi, and elsewhere in the diaspora. And so the whole philosophy of RPF, the predominant, if not the fundamental theme of RPF, was about going back home. And the regimes of the day simply had said, you know, either the country is too small. I think the regime used to say that Rwanda is like a glass full of water, and that if you put one extra drop, some extra drop must be dropped out of the glass. That was the philosophy of the day, and we simply didn't buy it. And so we inherited a very difficult situation in 1994. And so the point we need to make here is that whereas it was essentially an organization of Tutsi refugees, its philosophy was quite appealing because it was both nationalistic, talking about bringing together the Hutus and Tutsis. It was democratic because ourselves and others within the country, especially since the 90s, were saying that Rwanda under General Habyarimana had become a dictatorship. So was the previous regime of Kayibanda until 1993. And Tutsis in Rwanda when they lost power in 1959 to that, during that transition, until 1994, had actually become like second-class citizens in Rwanda, were either refugees or second-class citizens in Rwanda. And so after that was the kind of appeal that RPF came with. And many people within the country gave it a benefit of doubt. Many people believed in that. But over time, RPF fell into the same trap that MRND before it. MRND was the party of General Habyarimana. And MDL Paramehutu, this was the party of the first president, a Hutu as well, because the same dictatorial tendencies that they exhibited in their time, which actually pushed Rwanda into crisis and finally into civil war and genocide. These are the same characteristics that RPF has right now. And that's a point of departure. It's a point of concern because some of these things that have happened in Rwanda before, you can see the signals, the stress signals that existed before 1994. You can see them in Rwanda today.
Did you want to say something about that, Howard or Steve?
Yes, I did. You know, you talked about the end of history. I think I like the analogy, but I think we should modify the term a little bit. And what's happening in Rwanda is, under the current regime, is an effort to put an end to politics, to put an end to, in particular, the politics, any politics that have to do with ethnicity, to reject or to deny or to exclude any consideration of ethnicity, which sounds appealing at a certain level to people who live in a country that has experienced genocide, except for the fact that power continues to be structured. There's an intense correlation between ethnicity and power in Rwanda, and not just ethnicity and power, but on top of that, patterns of exile and repatriation in Rwanda, so that you not only have a Tutsi elite in Rwanda, but you have a super elite in Rwanda constituted of Tutsis who have spent large parts of their lives as exiles, predominantly in Uganda, which is a sort of accompanying factor to the shift of national language from French to English. You know, this is in part a difficult discussion because people think some friends of Rwanda would like to pretend, as would some people in power in Rwanda, that to raise these subjects is to make trouble. But I would make the opposite argument, and that is you cannot be a friend of Rwanda without raising these subjects. That suppressing the expression of identity in Rwanda and manipulating or maintaining political power along ethnic lines is a recipe for disaster. And that if you're a friend of Rwanda's, you cannot ignore those realities. You have to find a way to speak about these things and to encourage a healthy discussion of these things. Not to throw a bomb in a theater, but to say there will be no lasting peace and development in Rwanda until there's a political dispensation that lets all Rwandans feel equally represented and equally at home and equally invested in the nature of the system in their country. And I think that where we are today in Rwanda, the central problem that I think that this conversation will have to deal with is the fact that where we are with power in Rwanda is sort of the antithesis of that.
I know, Stephen, you want to say something. I just want to point out that not only is the discussion of ethnicity suppressed in Rwanda, but so are opposition political parties, independent newspapers, and the like, with lots of examples of people being jailed and executed. So this is not a hypothetical conversation. These are real threats.
I will not resist the temptation to enlighten you. Maybe we can switch on the light again so I can see your faces. Is that possible? Thank you. Okay. There's 2 points that I wanted to make. First of all, I was trying to be mischievous, because if you make an opening statement about Rwanda, the first thing you would say, if you have any basic expertise, is this is the country of the Hutus, the Tutsis, 85% Hutus, then you have the Tutsis, 14%, 1% Pygmies or Twas, and so you go. And here you are basically immediately, obviously Howard wouldn't let me get away with it, but you go and you immediately embrace a binary logic. And then you have the toggle switch, first the Tutsis in power under colonial time, promoted by the colonizer. At the end, by the way, ethnically split Belgian colonizer, has a binary logic itself, has bad feelings about promoting the minority, not very democratic, and the polarization is reversed, and you promote Hutus to hand power over to, and that's the recipe, and so on and so on. I did it on purpose. Howard knows that, of course, but he was right. I left out the basic element. I did it on purpose because if you look a little bit closer, and we'll be very short on that, the coup d'etat in '73 is actually southern Hutus being in power and northern Hutus, or regionalism, playing into, because there's not just one identity. As I'm not just white or Christian, Jew, or whatever, I have multiplicity of identities, and so have Rwandans. And they get a little bit imprisoned in these two identity categories that seem so prevalent and so intrinsically linked to power that it becomes a binary logic that I wanted to sort of upset and upend a little bit. Obviously, we will end up being there. Just to add, today, I don't see this as a Tutsi regime. Habyarimana's regime was a Hutu regime, but a northern or northwestern Hutu regime. So if you go a little bit more into the detail, and today I think this is a regime by a specific group of Tutsis. It's not a Tutsi regime. It's a very personalized dictatorship. That's why I like this. I don't like to be a revisionist, but I like this provocative title about revising Kagame. Kagame, for once, not to demonize him, but for once he's really center to our problematic. And it is people, as it was pointed out, who were in exile with him in Uganda, being the security apparatus of the Rwandan regime, which is a formative experience for them, coming from military intelligence background, doing the dirty work to bring General Museveni into power in Uganda. That's the background. And then you understand what Howard pointed to, the linguistics of power and so on and so forth. Just a second point. I would have never thought that I would be defending ethnicity somewhere. I would be so happy to put away with it, and not only in Rwanda, actually also here. But just imagine one day people would say, okay, race is scientifically a wrong category, which I think it is. Let us put away with our racist or racial categories, because then we will have solved the problem of racialism, racism, and all the rest of it. It doesn't work the way Howard argued in favor of that. You need these categories because that is the categories in which people think. And actually, the Twa, the organizations today in Rwanda who defend the pygmies, no one talks about them, of course, 1% and pygmies, Twas, who would talk about it? But they have to redefine actually their name because they are conflicting with the law. They are saying, we are going to come to the defense of the Twa. It's not allowed because you can't single them out. So you have to hide about what you're doing. It is as if we had anti-racist organizations and they were reproached with promoting racism because they cast their discourse in racial categories. So if I stick to ethnicity, it's not because I like it that much that I deny that ethnic categories, hate speech led to the genocide. It is just, as I think Howard already stated, if you put away with the categories, you try to end politics and you try to make it impossible to know, as it would be, how many people are black in our prisons. You don't know how many Tutsis are in the power structure today in Rwanda because it's a category that has become unspeakable. And that's the end of politics, and that's impossible because it freezes a dictatorship.
One of the questions that I have, I want to get to the question of development in a second, but before I go there, I want to ask a question. Theoden had talked about the fact that the RPF had been a fairly democratic, and at least in terms of its stated politics, force, and at least in terms of its aspirations. And now what we have is a very personalized kind of rule. And is it possible to briefly describe how we got there? Is it just is it simply a matter of needing to take a country that has been devastated by genocide and needing to rebuild it and revitalize it in some sustainable, secure way? Or is that too sort of facile an explanation?
Just to do this very quickly, because I think that we could really very easily end up at a level of detail that would not interest our audience here.
Okay.
But the RPF around the time of the incursion or invasion, if however you'd like to describe it, from Uganda, was a collective leadership with a number of very strong and interesting characters. And important things were decided really only at the end of intense discussion. What we ended up with was a very classic situation of a revolution eating its children. And all of many, or if not most, I should say most if not all of the characters who constituted that core of leadership ended up being destroyed or exiled through a variety of processes, very often violent. And we end up with a very strong central figure now who we all know, who's the subject of our talk here today, who wields power in a very old-fashioned way in terms of African politics. And a way that I would add, this doesn't only have to be a Rwandan conversation. We can look at the history of regimes in Africa that are organized around the personality of a single person to the extent that one sees this in Rwanda today, and history is full of examples.
Right.
And just at the level of statistics, we could say the chances of this turning out to be a really bad story in the end are very high. We wish you good luck, Rwanda, but the chances are, knowing how this works out in history, are this is going to end badly. So maybe you should think about reorganizing the state around other principles other than the personality of a single person.
So President Kagame is very much admired by international donors, as you've rightly pointed out, by some journalists and others, people who give him a lot of credit for turning Rwanda around and enabling it to make gains in development, in education and health. And I'm wondering how real you think those development gains are, and whether you think Kagame deserves credit for them.
I think two things. One is that, first of all, from the very start, let's give credit to Rwanda today. And credit, to be honest, it's only that in highly personalized politics, everything good that takes place in the country must go to the king, must go to the president, must go to the ruler. That's how these things work, everything that, but there are some of you in the audience who know very well that even for these issues of economic development in Rwanda and the positioning of Rwanda in the international community, that Kagame has not worked single-handedly to do that. That's the first thing that I want. And there are some people in this audience whom I know and whom I have worked with while I was ambassador and while I was Kagame's chief of staff, and where we worked extremely hard to sell this whole idea of creating prosperity for Rwanda and how it needs to be done. That's the first thing. Secondly, the issues of economic development for a poor country. Rwanda is a poor country. Essentially an agrarian economy, subsistence economy, as one of my colleagues mentioned. 11 million people, landlocked. A huge percentage of the country without the kind of knowledge and skills that you'd have in a modern economy. And this has been a problem before independence, after independence, during the previous regimes, as it has been in the current regime. So if you were going to assess the performance of a Rwandan president, it wouldn't be much about economic performance. Because look, every president who has ever come to Rwanda and who will come to Rwanda in the next 20, 30 years will always be highly dependent on foreign handouts in order to do most of the things, especially for an economy that runs on 60% to support the budget. So for every president of Rwanda who comes around, he cannot be celebrated on having done a miracle, because even now, right now as we speak, there's no economic miracle in Rwanda. It is only that we inherited an exceedingly difficult situation. And we've had to start from zero or below zero to build slowly by slowly. And to that extent, you can call it a miracle. But in terms of comparing Rwanda and previous regimes, yes, there's something that we've added. The current regime has added on that economic performance. But surely in terms of roads, infrastructure, in terms of all that, there is something good that even the previous regime were able to make. That is the second thing. But the fundamental thing about Rwanda is not about economic performance, because the previous president was toppled in first of all, the monarchy was not toppled because it wasn't developing peasants. It was about power in the hands of the king. The president who was toppled in 1973 was not toppled because of poor economic performance. No. Habyarimana, whose rule ended in 1994, and the program of RPF was not about economic performance. It was about redressing the critical problems of how power is structured in Rwanda, that it becomes an ethnic factor, and not only is it ethnicized, it becomes, really Rwanda is like the roles of the jungle operate. You know, in economics, they talk about the zero-sum game. In Rwanda, it is a very sharp and very vicious contest, at least until now. And everyone knows, the Tutsis know, the Hutus know, that if in that struggle you are the winner, it's not that you tell the winner, come on, we've won, come around and we share the spoils. The trouble with Rwanda is that whoever wins the contest has to decide the fate of the other side. And very often, the fate of the other side is very precarious. You're either killed, or you are hounded into exile, or you are put into jail, or you learn to live as second-class citizen in your own country. That was the situation of Tutsis before 94. That is the situation of Hutus since 1994. And so the innovation that Rwanda should be looking for, and for which hopefully also foreigners who are friends of Rwanda should be helping with us, is simply not to look the other side and say, oh, that does not exist. Instead is to figure out whether we can have a peaceful transformation that builds on the accomplishments that we've assumed so far until today, and try to contend with some of the problems that have really, really become very protracted and very deep-seated.
Teogen, when I asked that question, what I was referring to is that having come from Burundi and DRC into Rwanda, which I did recently, it is like entering another continent in a way. I mean, superficially at least, the visitor to Kigali does not see any trash on the streets, sees no plastic bags, for example, which are banned, cannot enter the airport with any plastic bags. All the roofs have been redone. People look industrious, okay, and I know that that's a very superficial comment, but again, in comparison to its neighbors, Rwanda looks good to the outside observer. And what do you say? What can you say about that?
Well, you said Theogene, I'm gonna steal your turn if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
As a journalist, this is something I've long been interested in, and I think that there are a number of reasons that help us to understand the favorable image that Rwanda enjoys internationally and particularly in the media. But one of them is simply what you've just mentioned, that it's a nice place to be a journalist. You cross the border from, and this is the way people are usually crossing the border, you've crossed the border from Goma, you get stuck up for a bribe on the other side. The Rwandans, very clean little booth, they stamp your thing and you're on your way. The road is good. There's no harassment between the border and Kigali when you get to your hotel. You get into your hotel and the internet works. And you go out for dinner and there's likely to be something that resembles the kind of food that you like to eat back home. And you go to a nightclub and it's filled with nicely dressed people and they like foreigners. And so all of these sort of self-interested little reasons end up playing actually quite an important role, I think, in terms of, this is one side of the coin, I would say. The other side of the coin to why Rwanda benefits, let me back up to say, I do not mean by what I'm saying to negate the idea that there's been any progress or anything achieved in Rwanda. That would be foolish. Of course there have been good realizations under the current leadership. I'm old enough to have known Rwanda before the current leadership, though, and Rwanda was a well-run country before the genocide as well. Rwanda's been a well-run, highly organized society for as long as I mean, it's probably always been like that, right? You're older than me. You can
Some people would argue that that
the
facilitated
principle of
the-
seniority? So I carry the day because I'm the oldest. I entirely agree. That's very important. And at the time, under Habyarimana, it was called the Switzerland of Africa. People were, especially everybody, engaged in some sort of what the French call a coopération or whatever aid business, was happy to be there. And it's interesting we say so because I think it hasn't changed on the other level either, because after some time you feel some uneasiness. Everything works, but then you feel that there is a form of spontaneous sincerity that is conspicuously absent. And you start thinking about the guy who bribed you on the Congolese side and the sort of case on the Congolese side in a very positive light. Under Habyarimana, maybe after ethnicity now I'm defending anarchy, I moved into the Eastern Congo. I was happy. I liked it because I felt that this, morbid atmosphere that was there. I will briefly give you an anecdote. There was one taxi woman. She was probably, you would know her, just one Tutsi taxi woman in Kigali. And I used to take her as a journalist. And she would, while asking me for directions where to go, tell me how her daughter was raped. And I stopped her and said, I can't take that. Either you tell me the story and then we sit together and that's it, or you drive me and I give you direction and you talk about this extreme level of violence, the suspicion. You say social revolution, you are pro-Hutu because social revolution is that. You don't acknowledge today that genocide is an ongoing process since '59. You are an enemy of the people in power. And so everything is a minefield. And things work, and I do appreciate that, like anybody does, and I give credit to the regime. Now, being very prosaic, when you start after genocide, you also start from ground zero. So having 7-8% of growth rate being funded after genocide by the international community is a sad and cynical thing to say. It's not the same as developing Ivory Coast, for example, but just keep these very simplistic things in mind. They are important. I don't think there is an economic vision that is viable because if you look at the figures, it is not ICT that will bring Rwanda out of poverty. It is tourism, it is tea, it's coffee, it's what it has always been. And when you hear then that the peasants get out of the hills and now by law are obliged to rent, to lease shoes and clothing when they go to the marketplace so they don't look poor, and then they give it back, you get an idea about the, I use the word total, I could say totalitarian nature of the regime, and I have a little disagreement about when it actually became personalized. We all know strong men, weak institutions in Africa. When the genocide happened, the RPF, and I don't like to say so, but that's my experience, my interactions with Kagame, the RPF had already become a personalized, a streamlined organization where Kagame pushed a button, and the Rwandans of Hutu origin that were integrated into the regime, it was pure tokenism. And those who were serious about building that democracy were afterwards eliminated. So it's not something like after genocide and over time, Kagame just imposed himself.
I said after incursion.
No problem about it. It's just I wanted to be clear about the timing. It's not something that happened over the course of the 1990s. It happened very early on, probably while the RPF was fighting its way to power. Kagame just eliminated, and we know some of the people he did, eliminated people, and the RPF had become something else than a democratic movement and a democratic hope for Rwanda. I will leave it there.
I just want to sort of pick up.
I also have very briefly something to say because you're talking about RPF, which I belong to. I want to have a comment on that because I may have a bit of disagreement on that.
Just very
Right,
quickly
Howard,
on
go
the
ahead and then
total
Yeah.
totalitarianism thing, which I think is really important. So a lot of the applause that one hears for Rwanda, one of the things that bothers me in this discourse is that the putative friends of Rwanda who are in the sort of cheering corner of Rwanda on so many issues, look how well it's doing, look how orderly it is, look how there's reconciliation, this and that. Those very same people would never accept to live under the same sorts of political dispensations themselves, ever. Ever. I mean, they couldn't imagine it. But it's okay in a kind of patronizing way for, black people 6,000 miles away to live that way, because we all know that black people are not capable of very much. And look, they had They had a genocide 17 years ago, and look, now they're not killing each other anymore. So that's progress. Singapore is not a country that has historically enjoyed very good press in this country. Why? Because we say, Singapore? Yeah, they've grown very fast and all this, but you know, they've constrained civil liberties, and you can't even chew gum there, and you know, everything's sterile, and you know, you can't. They have ethnically sort of predetermined sort of ethnic controls over politics, et cetera. So we say the same kind of amen corner for Rwanda kind of people say, look at this, they're trying to build the new Singapore of Africa. Isn't this a great thing? Why are you all complaining? Without the least sense of irony, that Singapore is in fact a place that most of them would not want to live.
Right. Okay, Teojin, and then
the question as it will take us another conversation really. At what point did RPF become overtly and fundamentally dictatorial compared to maybe what it used to be in the beginning? Because you would need really to look at the anatomy of a liberation movement, and you know them, you know, in the 70s, in the 80s. Liberation movements are not particularly, internally, they are not particularly democratic animals, as you know. But at least in the beginning, because of the attempt to survive, and you can only survive if you have some kind of shared and collective mechanisms of governing. In the beginning, RPF had these traits of what you might call internal democracy. You would make the same arguments about NRM in Uganda, about the liberation movements in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, and of course you've been following Zimbabwe, you've looked at Angola, you've looked at Mozambique, and even currently in South Africa. They were not fully democratic, but at least within there was some kind of collective bargaining that allows the organization to survive in extremely difficult circumstances. But over time, RPF also has had misfortunes of losing some of its more charismatic and maybe more conciliatory or more consensus-driven kind of leaders, like its first leader who died on the second day of the Civil War, General Rwigema, and others who died immediately after. And so the current President Kagame, also took over the organization at an exceptionally difficult point in the development of this organization. In fact, had it not been also the highly disciplined character of President Kagame, probably also we might say the organization would have perished in the very beginning. But it's these same traits that allowed RPF to survive in the early phase and to be able to survive and win the Civil War, that in another phase of development where different characteristics are required, because the characteristic of running a liberation movement, especially a liberation movement that is in the phase of fighting a war, the new traits that are required in Rwanda today are not more the ones of forcing discipline on the population. The requirements needed right now in Rwanda are for a leader who is able actually to bring together all these stakeholders that are largely polarized and bring together towards a common vision of transforming Rwanda. So I think the RPF was, I wouldn't say that was, what is the term? You know, sometimes I think in Kinyarwanda, and I have to think about the equivalent in English. But it was not designed finally.
Jeffersonian Democrat.
Yes, it wasn't required. It wasn't destined to become like this. But over time, of course, President Kagame took advantage of what was going on, and the elements of collaboration that were exhibited, especially at the beginning after the war in 1994, and thereafter working with other political organizations that had actually been very, very critical in fighting the Habyarimana regime. We worked with them for a brief period of time, and within 1 year, the likes of Senator Shonga and Twagiramungu, they are retrenched immediately. And once that was done, Kagame turned his guns onto his own colleagues. So to a certain extent, the RPF and the current situation in Rwanda has become the typical situation where a revolution eats its own children.
Okay, Stephen, and then I have one further question, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience.
I just wanted to state that I think that Kagame is not to be blamed for everything. Especially there is a strong dimension of self-blinding of the international community after genocide, a deep-rooted and very understandable guilt feeling. And so very often in discussions, we spoke initially about the sort of binary antipodian character of this. You get classified, you pigeonhole other people, and then you pitch people against each other. You feel very uncomfortable because I give all the credit to people who fall for Kagame. First of all, he has qualities. You like people who push a button and something happens, effectual policy. So, and service provision is good in Rwanda. If you look at education, health system, I can make arguments about a lot of things, but one has to give it to him. But the worst is he is not to be blamed for what we do to ourselves. We don't think straight when it comes to Rwanda. Because we don't get right that Rwandans killed Rwandans, to put it very, very brutally, and that the non-assistance that we are responsible for, that this could happen, that the non-assistance of the outside world would give us primary responsibility. And there is a myth going around. The myth is not about Kagame. The myth is about you just needed a little bit of political will in 1994, and President Clinton could have sent in a little force and no genocide would have happened. This is a myth, which actually came up only years after the genocide. If you study that, what it would have needed, within which time frame and what sort of contingent to move in to stop genocide in Rwanda, you come to something that has nothing to do with just political will. Not to speak about the fact that would I want my children to be sent into Darfur or Rwanda like this, when I don't really know who is who and where's the good and evil, etc. There's a lot of questions. It has become oversimplified. And now there's so much guilt feeling in the international community about what happened in Rwanda, and I don't want to sort of diminish that guilt feeling. There's a lot to feel guilty about. And no one can say, I did a good job when genocide happened in one part of the world. That's understood. But you don't want to turn guilt into a sort of rent-seeking economy. It can't happen. If something led to genocide, it was the absence of public liberties and the absence of democracy. How could the lesson be that we put up with less democracy and the absence of civil liberties to lead to what, if not probably to a repetition of mass violence? I just wanted to point it out because not only are we being manipulated by Kagame, this is true, but there's something, a dimension that I even think much thicker that lies with us, the parallel with Holocaust. I understood about the Jewish Holocaust. Now I look for a parallel in Africa and I find actually myths in this and a misunderstanding, the impatience to really get ingrained knowledge about a place, all this place, and we are blinding ourselves more than Kagame manipulates us.
But you know, Stephen, part of the other piece of this blinding ourselves, which is not related to the guilt, which I couldn't agree more about as being fundamental to understanding our behavior, you know, from the outside. But the other piece to this is, you know, why we so willfully blind ourselves about Rwanda is because it relates to what would have been required to successfully intervene had that been a realistic proposition to begin with. Fixing another country is, as we know in this country from recent experience, is really, really difficult stuff. You know, going into any other country and saying, okay, what are your problems? We're here to fix them for you, is incredibly difficult. And if it's in Africa, which is like the furthest region of the universe from the American sort of daily, sort of ongoing, everyday psyche, not to mention calculation of national security interests, then nobody wants to go in and fix anybody's problems, any serious problems in Africa. That's like, you know, Stephen and I covered Africa for many years at the same time, and he was working in the French press, and I was working in the American press, and there was this really funny thing about not from Stephen, but from many of his French colleagues, this idea that there was an obsession in the United States about taking over Africa, and taking over Africa from France. That France, so that
Our China.
The whole sort of presumption was that, you know, if you follow this logic, that big parts of Africa belong to France, and the United States wants to take them over. I mean, I just couldn't. I'd fall out of my chair laughing at night sometimes when I would hear this from French colleagues. We don't want to take over anything in Africa.
No, we don't.
I mean, as far as accepting responsibility is concerned, if it can profit from certain things, fine. But take over in the sense of having to hold the bag, forget it. Forget it. And so it's much easier to sort of take the guilt on the one hand and take this real sort of narrow-minded, slovenly kind of laziness in terms of our conception of our role in the world and responsibility, and including moral responsibility and things like that, and say, look, it's peaceful in Rwanda. This Kagame guy, you know, let him have all the good press he wants. That's not really what we're preoccupied with. It's not, they're not shooting or stabbing each other right now. Nobody's saying we have to intervene. For us, that's a net good in the narrowest sense of the word. Never mind that you're keeping the lid on the kettle for the next 15 years or 12 years or 28 years or whatever it's going to take for the next cycle of this thing, when it's all going to blow up in a much worse way. And this is all foreseeable. But the easy thing to do is simply to say, you know, avert your eyes, you know, smile, pretend like it really is good stuff happening over there, and just let things be.
You answered my question, so thank you. I think I'd like to move now to the audience participation part of the evening. I'm going to ask Tim Gallimore to come up. Oh, I can't see with the lights in my eyes, but maybe Tim can come up and give us a brief, some brief comments on the conversation thus far, and then we'll reach out to all of you.
Thank you for giving me opportunity, for inviting me to the presentation, and for being brave enough to sponsor the presentation to OSI. I'm going to take full advantage of this time that you've given me, and if I get to 10 minutes, tell me to stop, and I will stop. There are many things that have been said tonight that really bear much more scrutiny, and I know the forum is not the very best to go into the detail, but there are several statements, generalizations, accusations that were made that I find no justification, no evidence for at all on the international stage, in the press, or anywhere else where credible human beings would look. And at the end of my presentation, I can give you very specifics of some of the things that the panelists and the moderator have said that I want to take issue to, because they do not lie anywhere in reality that I know about and other reasonable people know about. But as far as my contribution to this discussion, I want to take a very strong departure from the what has been said and done here, and to focus very specifically on what I think is beneath some of the anxiety and the discomfort that some of the panelists expressed about Rwanda and its present government and leadership. As a U.S. State Department consultant, I was among the first Americans who went to Rwanda in 1997 to assist the country in rebuilding the journalistic corps and establishing a private media system. During that visit, I had a chance to talk with Ambassador Charles Staples about expectations that the U.S. government had for the development of democracy and conducting elections in Rwanda. He assured me that the State Department would view Rwanda as a special case because of the devastation that took place in that society through the genocide. He said that the U.S. would not push Rwanda to conduct elections and to do all the other things that we consider in the West to be measures of democracy. It's unfortunate that the promise of Ambassador Staples and the goodwill of others, including human rights organizations, have not prevailed with respect to Rwanda's recovery and political development. Over the years, I've noticed that there has been a double standard when it comes to assessments of democracy in Rwanda, justice in Rwanda, freedom of expression in Rwanda, and human rights in Rwanda. No other country, not even the United States, is being held to the standards and expectations that are being imposed on Rwanda in many crucial domains. The fact that we're having this panel discussion, titled and advertised that it was, and laced with some of the poisonous rhetorical questions that were poised to guide the discussion, is evidence that there is a double standard being applied when it comes to Rwanda and to President Kagame. It's hard to imagine that a similar panel would be assembled to examine the myth of President Obama, or the myth of the Prime Minister of Israel, or any other world leader for that matter, or to explore in serious public debate the unsubstantiated charges and allegations of serious crimes that have been made against Paul Kagame. Read the announcement, the advertisement for this panel, from where I draw these conclusions. Now, we're not here to debate the wisdom or appropriateness of the U.S. trying to make the world over in its own image. but it is necessary to examine the double standard that is being applied to Rwanda, especially in the area of freedom of expression, and particularly when it comes to the laws that are against the denial of genocide of the Tutsi that took place in 1994. Yes, freedom of expression is an important component of a free society and for ensuring human rights of individuals. But freedom of expression is not absolute. It has its limitation, always has and it always will in every society. I know what I'm talking about because I have a PhD in mass communications with a specialization in media law and international communications. In fact, I wrote a doctoral dissertation about freedom of expression as it relates to the United States. The history of freedom of expression in the United States contains many chapters about suppression of dissidents, aliens, legal and otherwise, communists, socialists of every stripe, of unpopular religious groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the silencing of other critical voices and vulnerable minorities who question the orthodoxy of their day and express political views that the majority found intolerable or offensive. These groups and their ideas were characterized as threats to domestic government, to the peace, and they were considered a clear and present danger. It is hypocritical for human rights organizations in the U.S. and elsewhere to act as if these practices do not still exist in democratic countries and that they point to as paragons of virtue when it comes to freedom of expression and respect for human rights. American journalists are still obligated to obey court injunctions and gag rules that put prior restraint on their right to broadcast and publish what they please. Libel and invasion of privacy are recognized civil offenses that journalists and private parties are still accountable for under U.S. law. It is at your peril today, as an American, if you exercise freedom of expression and choose to threaten the life or limb of the president or anyone in the line of succession to the presidency. With respect to genocide, denial laws, and expression about ethnicity and divisionism, we're not talking about threatening the life of a single person, but of a group that has been targeted for extermination and partially was exterminated in 1994 and before. In the United States, we recognize that as a limitation in 2011 to threaten the life of the president or anyone in succession to the presidency. Today, freedom of expression is prohibited if we look at the resulting imminent lawless action that people look at speech for and say, when it comes to these kinds of expressions, we ought not to tolerate them. America still finds it necessary to publish speech and to guard against evils. Rwanda must also be vigilant against this clear and ever-present danger of genocide manifested in the ideology and action of those who have vowed to finish the job that they started in 1994. They have expressed it in church houses and schoolhouses across the country. They have expressed it to UN staff members, UN tribunal staff members, and publicly on Rwandan public radio stations. The history of such expression in Rwanda testifies definitively that there is no greater threat to the nation than the imminent lawless action promised by these would-be perpetrators. So in response to this documented danger, the government of Rwanda conducted studies, held parliamentary debates, promulgated laws, prohibited genocide ideology, denying, negating, minimizing, justifying, or approving of genocide, and prohibiting discrimination and sectarianism. Instead of applauding these measures as prudent actions of a responsible government, Rwanda has been severely criticized and accused of suppressing political dissent, of media censorship, and of denying human rights. The double standard is even more obvious when you consider that laws against Holocaust and genocide denial exist in more than 15 countries around the world, including Rwanda. No other country with similar laws is criticized as Rwanda is. Rwandans today are free to say what they want to say. I was just there, 2 months there, came back in August. People have told me all kinds of things, including criticism of the government, people in the parliament, in the media, and in the streets. They can say what they want. There is no prior restraint exercised by the government in Rwanda that I know of. However, genocide deniers, minimizers, trivializers, sympathizers must face the consequences of their expressions and pay the price for their illegal actions. It took more than 150 years of freedom of expression to mature to the level where it is now in the United States. Rwanda is being asked to reach the same level of tolerance just 17 years after the devastating genocide, primarily moved by the media and discussion in the society. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an unfair and vicious double standard. The United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of incarcerated population in the world. The United States is fifth among nations with the death penalty that still execute prisoners. In 2010, the U.S. executed 46 people. America's record on the use of torture, an extraordinary rendition of suspects to countries like Libya, is well known. The systemic discrimination against ethnic minorities is a continuing pervasive practice in American society, as is racial profiling by law enforcement agencies. In fact, the courts just stepped in Texas last week to hold up an execution of an African-American man in Texas because they have found that the judicial system was racist, and also there were racist comments made by an expert witness during the course of the proceedings. Now, two wrongs never justify any wrongdoer, but the United States and members of this panel are hardly in a position to be lecturing anyone about human rights abuses, never mind lecturing Rwanda, which has made remarkable progress in dispensing justice and establishing or reestablishing the rule of law after the genocide against the Tutsi minority in 1994. I'm almost finished.
Oh, thank you.
I also question the motives and the agenda of detractors, critics, and defectors who represented the government of Rwanda and worked side by side with President Paul Kagame for years before denouncing the very same government and president for crimes that, if we should believe their accusations, they themselves would have been complicit in committing against the Rwandan people. The reasonable and ordinary common sense person would require explanation for how it is that these critics and defectors have just suddenly come to see so clearly the wrongdoing of their colleagues and compatriots after being blind to these infractions for such a very long time. Why is it that they have waited until they are no longer enjoying the benefits of their position with this government in Rwanda to denounce and decry it as criminal and repressive? Those are my remarks, and I can go to the specifics of some of the other allegations that were made here that are repeated in the press and in human rights reports and amnesty reports that have not been verified. Even New York Times reports on some of these issues, circulating rumors and innuendos and accusations without facts to establish them.
Thank you, Dr. Gallimore. I think we're going to now turn to the audience. And I believe a mic is going to be handed around. Is that correct? So Stephen, do you want to handle that, or do you want me to call on people? Okay. Yes, the gentleman here waving his hand. I'm going to go like this.
Thank you very much. Little bit of context so you can put my remarks into perspective. I've been working in Rwanda since 2000. I was actually introduced to President Kagame by Theogene, whom I consider to be a good friend. We're on opposite sides of this issue, but we've managed to keep our friendship intact. And I've actually been in Africa since 1979. I was reminding Howard that we met on an old country bus in Kenya once, and it was the first time my name was ever in the newspaper when Howard quoted me. I was 21 years old.
Oh, by the way, can you introduce yourself when you speak, by the way? I think
this is the long introduction,
okay.
The long painful. My name is Michael Fairbanks. From 2001 to 2006, I was a paid consultant to the government of Rwanda working on export competitiveness. Since that time, I'm a member of President Kagame's Council of Advisors together with Tony Blair and Rick Warren and others. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've spent a lot of time in the country and lived there about 90% of the time this year. I'm confused, guys. I'm confused. You hold up the filter of ethnicity so strongly, but it doesn't reflect at all the country that I've come to know. And in 2008, I became a citizen of Rwanda because I am one of the people that wants to live there, wants to get to know it better, think it's a good place to live. And here's what I see. This year, economic growth will be 11%. Over the last decade, it's averaged 8% a year. The structure of the economy is changing because in the key export sector, wages are up 30% on a compounded annual growth basis. We're seeing remittances, even in the downturn of the global economy, stay strong. foreign investment is actually up. This week, President Kagame will receive no less than 3 awards by the United Nations, different groups in the United Nations, and is the co-chair of the Millennium Development Goals Project. Clearly, the global political political market is rewarding Rwanda for something that it's doing very well. It's inconsistent with the view that you're putting forward. I need to reconcile that somehow, because all 3 of you are famous, all 4 of you are famous. Your views are time-tested and been in the market in the form of books and articles and speeches for many, many years. It's been fully appreciated by the market. Surely you can't really be serious to say that the world integrates with the Rwandan economy based on a notion of guilt. I mean, surely there's something there that makes the world want to integrate with Rwanda and Rwanda to integrate with the world. So just help me understand how we reconcile your view, which I would regard as extreme, with the way Rwanda is engaging the rest of the world right now. So help me understand.
I think before we respond to individual questions, I'd like to take a couple of them and then we can group them together just to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. The gentleman in the back with the gray shirt.
Thank you. My name is Eric Miller. I'm the acting director of Save the Congo US. We're an NGO based in London. I'm setting up a branch in DC. Just got off the train a few hours ago to come here. My question is this. We're all talking about double standards, but the double standard I see is, why has everyone forgotten the Congo? 5 million people have died there, and nobody's talking about genocide there. Everybody's talking about the genocide in Rwanda. I acknowledge it. It was awful. It's one of the greatest crimes in the last century. And yet, right across the border, millions of people have died, and no one is talking about it. Your own organization, the New York Times, they write 1/4 of the amount of articles as they do on Darfur. And yet, 300,000 people have died in Darfur, 5 million in the Congo, nothing is done. Why is it a war criminal such as Paul Kagame is lauded by the UN, is given special awards, is taken to different platforms at universities, and is lauded as a great statesman when he is a war criminal? Under any other circumstances, there would be a special tribunal right now by the UN in the Congo. Why is that not happening? Why isn't anyone talking about this? Why is everyone defending a war criminal?
Okay, thank you for your
Sorry
question.
if I was hyperbolic.
No, I'm going to take one more question and I'm going to turn to the panel, okay? There's a woman in the back with her hand up wearing a white turtleneck. Yes, the person who's looking around.
I actually have 3 questions.
Oh dear. Can
I'm
you
just
ask
going
us
to
one?
be very brief.
Okay.
I would like to, my name is Janet Lee. I'm an attorney practicing in New York, but I was actually in Rwanda once in 2003. I would like to get some assessment as to how you think that the Gacaca trial is going at this point, and whether or not it has a role in unifying the country, and whether it has contributed to the functioning of its judiciary, and whether it can actually be able to serve as a viable model for others. The second question I had was, given the history of displacements, how did the Rwandan government determine property rights or property disputes, especially among the returnees coming from abroad, trying to reclaim their property? The third question is actually, I'm sort of piggybacking on the gentleman who just spoke. What is exactly the rationale behind President Kagame's policy in DRC, and whether or not such a rationale is really justifiable? Those are my 3 questions.
Okay, thank you. That's a lot of stuff for the panel to handle. Are there any particular questions you would like to speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I would just like to begin with a corrective. I don't represent the New York Times. I once worked for the gentleman who asked the question. I once worked for the New York Times. I don't work for the New York Times any longer.
Okay.
It's been a few years already. I teach at Columbia University. I have done everything in my power to raise awareness about what's happened in the Congo. The Congo is my principal sort of avenue of interest toward Rwanda, because I think, not because I'm uninterested in Rwanda, but precisely because I think that Rwanda has been so decisive in the contemporary fortunes of a much bigger country, its neighbor, the Congo, in which an even larger tragedy has sort of unfolded over the last several years. And as the questioner said, somehow this has largely managed to escape any kind of purchase on our consciences or ordinary ongoing attention by the media. The first question, though, I'd like to return to, so I'm not sure I understand where there's a contradiction. That there's a leader named Paul Kagame who goes around and he gets awards, and people celebrate him and give him money and give aid to his government and support it in various ways. The world history is full of examples of people who have been supported wrongly, people who didn't deserve, with the benefit of hindsight, a very clear argument could be made that they didn't deserve the kind of support that they got. I'm not even saying that he's not worthy of support. I'm saying we need to have a really careful conversation about the nature of the state there, the nature of power there, the nature of the national dispensation there, the nature of social justice there, especially if we're going to go giving him so much money, so much support, so much aid, and so many prizes. Let's think about this really carefully. I don't think it's been thought about very carefully. I think the process has been dominated by the two impulses that we discussed. The guilt on the one hand, which induces a moral laziness, and the sort of fear of getting caught holding a bag should you try something experimental and the thing blows up. It's easier just to let it be, to celebrate the guy, to laud the guy, because there's no surface panic or blood in the streets at the moment. I'm happy if the Rwandan economy is doing as well as you're doing. I'm not an enemy of Rwanda. If peasant incomes are rising and the structure of the economy is changing in Rwanda, I think I'm as excited by that as you are. I'm not sure that it's happening that way, but if it is true that it's happening that way, that's fantastic news. My problem is that if you don't settle the questions of political dispensation, knowing Africa the way I know it, knowing human beings the way I know them, one day something awful is going to happen again. And so that's why you need to think about this now. All of the economic growth in the world won't change that. All of the prizes and laurels and awards and honorifics and things like that that you can give somebody will not change that either. A political dispensation is a political dispensation. And either it's a good one that represents people broadly in the society, which everyone can feel that they have ownership in and see their own images and fortunes and fates reflected in, or not. And I personally feel that I'm not a Rwandan, it's not for me to decide, but I am an observer. And as an observer, my best reading is that there are serious problems on the political dispensation side.
Can I?
Very briefly, and then I was going to insert myself and then move on to a few more questions.
By the way, this is part of the problem. It's a critique towards this organization because you cannot raise the issues of Rwanda in 1 hour. You cannot.
Not to
and
mention
I hope,
the DRC on top of
yes,
it.
so I hope we shall make, on behalf of this audience, we shall make a request to OSI that there shall be another time when we can really go a little deeper into this substantive question. But I wanted to comment on what my very good friend, Michael Fairbank, stated, and briefly what also the new, I don't know whether Garmo is the representative of the Rwandan government, because I could see the passion with which he defended the current government of Rwanda and Kagame himself. I hope, Michael, you don't think that you love Rwanda more or Kagame loves Rwanda more than most Rwandans who passionately pursue the goal of being part of this country. Michael, you know, let me say this, as I've said it on other occasions. I'm one of those people who was raised as a refugee for 3 decades. And I became part of the RPF as part of that dream of going back home and transforming that country. in my entire life, which spans slightly over 5 decades, I have lived in Rwanda only 5 years. 5 out of 5 decades. You might say, yes, Theogene, that's up to you. It's self-imposed exile, as Gary more unkindly described some of us. We take no offense about that. But Rwanda, I can assure you, is much my country as Kagame is. And Michael Fairbank, who knows me very well because I introduced him to Kagame, knows that I know Kagame very well, more than he does. And part of the problem... You were brothers with him. Yes. Part of the problem, actually, the charge should be leveled even against somebody like me because I oversold the brand called Kagame. I sold it to the US government. I sold it to the British government. And I go back to the same halls of power and they say, by the way, and then they say, but you used to tell us that Kagame is a good guy and is the best guy for Rwanda. How come that you're now telling us that he's a bad guy? So you can see, especially within the US context, it's kind of, they want to see things in black and white. Is the good guy, bad guy kind of situation. And that's not the mindset that a Rwandan would have. But I want to tell you, Michael, that just 4 things that tells you that Rwanda deserves change and is in time for change. Number 1, it's only RPF, the ruling power, that can even go to what you describe as elections, the type of elections that Kagame repeatedly gets 95%. It's only his party that goes to the electorate with some other manipulated political organization that he calls political parties, but he goes to, that is number 1. Number 2, people who demanded they should participate in elections are simply in jail or killed. You know political prisoners who are in Rwanda today. This is no secret. You know people who've been killed because of attempting to be in politics. You know people who've been hounded into exile because of that. So that is the second thing. The third thing, which my colleague Garmo was talking about and which our friend from talking about Congo, Rwanda, after genocide, I'm not one of, as you know, I'm a Tutsi and I was part of the RPF. Sometimes I've come into public to say I'm sorry for some of the things that my own organization might have committed, even if I'm not the one who killed people, but the organization to which I belonged committed crimes and they should be brought to account. The problem with Rwanda, and Kagame is instrumental in that, is that there is a mapping report about Congo, about war crimes, about crimes against humanity, even possible acts of genocide that were committed by our own forces in Congo. And there are human rights abuses that were committed in Rwanda. The problem with justice in Rwanda today is that whereas, and rightly so, the people who committed genocide have been, and there is a process of continuing to bring them to justice in Gacaca and International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, but it has become like a victor's justice that targets those who committed crimes against Tutsis, but when it comes to Kagame and his colleagues being brought to account for crimes committed against Hutus in Rwanda and in the Congo, and for the Congolese who've been killed, both Kagame throws a tantrum and the international community simply stays silent. That kind of situation is a distorted picture of what goes in the country. Number 4, you know very well, and it will be my last one. Number 4, you know that when you have the structure of a power in a country like Rwanda, where the issue of ethnicity tends to be very strong, you better be extremely conscious. And Michael, you used to come to Rwanda. Rwandans, we have a very, because I was running this office, we have a very scripted way of what to show the foreigners. Rwanda, every Rwandan you meet in the system, I used to be the one to give them the script of what to tell these foreigners. And the problem, if you go to Rwanda and you're going there for the first time, it's a very organized society. Too silent for my own comfort. And what you see is what the system designs for you to see. And it is not a Kagame creation. It is not a Kagame creation. Those before him have always organized this society like that. And therefore, in our conversation tonight, even though it sounds like Kagame just, it's simply because Kagame has become the state and the state has become Kagame, which was the case even before him. And so the challenge is not to divide people about those who are pro-Kagame and those who are Kagame, but as a society, we have a serious problem, Michael. If you are a friend of Kagame, and Garimo is a friend of Kagame too, and you know we are also people who love Rwanda, help us at least to tell Kagame that for those who do not say the kind of things you don't like to hear, it's not that they are enemies of Rwanda, it's because they love Rwanda as much as you do. Can you talk to them? So if Rwandans will demand that the government of Rwanda talks to the opposition, surely, is that too much to ask from a government, especially a government that we call our own? Or if we tell the government that stop hounding us and trying to kill us in exile, is that asking for too much? Or if we say let other political organizations participate in the political process, is that really too much? Apparently, all those things I've mentioned, we do not even need aid. We don't need aid to create conditions that are good for refugees to return, because right now, Michael, there are so many hundreds of refugees. I've discovered there are several hundreds of thousands of people who are Rwandans who are looking for going back home. So it's not about who loves Rwanda and who doesn't. And surely, having clean streets and having all this and GDP, this can be done in a matter of 100 days.
Okay, Stephen, and then I'm going to call on a few more people.
I just wanted to say that there is an obvious link with the Congo. We spoke about the human rights violations. I don't think there's a numerical argument to be made. I'm afraid to say so, because it's not only about numbers and putting the genocide of the Tutsis with the people died in Congo, maybe room for another discussion. I think we should, when we speak about corruption in Rwanda and the governance issue, the good governance of Rwanda, think about the fact that this is predicated on the exploitative relations with neighboring Congo, and that we actually have state-organized plunder that funds Rwanda. That's another just a bit. So many questions will be unanswered tonight that I just wanted to attract your attention to a book I haven't written in, I'm not involved in, but we have the privilege of having 20 American anthropologists and political scientists having done field work. None of them will be able to go back to the democracy of Paul Kagame, unfortunately. But you know, they took their courage, and it is actually in memory of Alison Deforge, and it's called Remaking Rwanda, State
Excellent.
Construction and Human Rights After Mass Violence. And I think it's a wonderful pluralistic view. It's critical, but it's not demonizing. And if anyone, there's chapters about Gacaca, you would get better answers than we will be able to provide within the next 10, 15 minutes, just for anyone who's interested. It's Scott Strauss and Lars Waldorf, the editors.
Thank you for saying that. And there's also HRW reports on Gacaca and lots of stuff on the DRC. I'm calling on more people. You, sir. And we actually have to close on time tonight, so I'm going to add.
Thank you. My name is Frank Lefevre. I'm a retired neuroscientist, and unfortunately, a water main break, which paralyzed the transit system, made me miss most of the presentation. So maybe my concern has already been addressed. If so, you can please tell me. And my concern is this, that even people who present very cogent and sometimes very fierce criticisms of Kagame nonetheless include in the things that they publish a mantra which I'm really sick of hearing. The mantra, I'm sure you could recite it in your sleep. It goes something like, "Stopped a genocide in which mostly Tutsis were killed." Stopped the genocide in which mostly Tutsis were killed. Now, to me, that's about like saying Adolf Hitler stopped World War II, in which mostly Germans and a few moderate Russians were killed. Now, I'm going to make some assertions here, and I have some references on the bottom of this flyer to back them up.
I need to actually call in some other people. So I'm going to
Excuse me, may I complete what I'm starting to say?
You'll need to formulate a question, because
right,
we've
because I
got
have
like
other
5 more
people
minutes.
I'd like to call on. I mean, so maybe you could just finish the sentence, please.
Excuse me?
I would like to
I can do this in less time than you've taken to interrupt me.
Okay.
Kagame did not come riding in to stop killing in 1994. His gang invaded Rwanda in 1990 4 years before to begin the genocide. He orchestrated and accomplished much of the killing, including killing of Tutsis by Hutus and by his own men. The evidence suggests more Hutus than Tutsis were killed.
Sorry,
And
okay.
that was from 1990 until the end of 1994. He continued beyond this in Rwanda and in Congo.
Okay, I'm going to thank you very much for your comment. Are there other questions? I saw some people in the back. Is there anybody? Yes, in the back, sir. Go ahead with the blue shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to make this short and sweet.
Thank you.
Will Mr. Kagame rule beyond 2017? Yes or no?
I think
That
that
Short
should,
and sweet.
that should be directed to him, really. Yeah.
It doesn't look like a...
But I listened to, he was in France a couple of days ago, and that question was put to him, and his response was, let's wait until 2017. So.
Come to that bridge, then I
Okay.
will tell you.
Yeah.
I said-
Okay, so the concluding question goes to Elizabeth. You're sitting right here. This is the last question, and then we'll close.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm Elizabeth Barrett. I'm also at the New York City Bar's African Affairs Committee and have been to Rwanda many times. But assuming the panel agrees that something's going to explode eventually, is there any organized opposition in the diaspora? And also, Theojan, because I think you were personally accused for defecting. If I'm not being too personal, I wondered what happened. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I don't. My answer is not really an answer. I don't really know about what's happening in the diaspora. I don't think that the destiny of Rwanda will be decided in the diaspora, and that's why political rights and civil rights and things like that are so important in Rwanda. I just want to say really, really quickly in response to the very first speaker that the double standard that's being the most glaring double standard of tonight is that we're having a conversation in which Rwanda. The Rwandan government was allowed to have its point of view, was actually invited from the very beginning to have its point of view defended, and in the end, in fact, had its point of view defended, and quite vigorously. I don't think that we could have a conversation like this in Rwanda. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. That's a double standard.
Okay. Any further comments from the panelists?
In terms of this is part of the challenge, really, because unless you open up space within the country, then politics tend to be externally organized. This is what happened to RPF, because within Rwanda, that organization was not possible. So we organized from outside Rwanda. That's number one. Number two, once you close the political space for peaceful politics, politics tend to be radicalized. These are the two dangerous signals that you need to register, especially with regard to Rwanda, that politics are driven outside the country, and number two, with time they become radical. To answer the question whether this implosion that we're talking about is surely coming, I do not think that it's inevitable. It's not inevitable that Rwanda is going to implode. But if it's not to become inevitable, then there are certain things that we need to be doing right now. And some of those things that we mentioned are issues of human rights, addressing the question of human rights, and addressing the question of opening up the political space. Because this will diffuse, number one, the situation, because it will drive politics within the country. And number two, it will also diffuse the situation, since people will say, in the absence of good politics, peaceful politics, people want to take up arms. When I was young, as Michael Fairbank knows, the natural thing, because I was a leftist and I knew that the way to remove a government is take up arms and shoot them out of power. But I've become aged.
More reasonable.
And these days my preoccupation is, if you look at our society where you can draw a triangle, and this triangle, one side are the perpetrators, the other side of the triangle are the victims, and yes, the other side of the triangle are people we call the bystanders. Now, Rwandans gravitate between these two poles. Sometimes you're a victim, tomorrow you become a perpetrator. The perpetrator of today becomes the victim of tomorrow. And the people I call the bystanders, people like you, those who are not Rwandans, you cannot afford to say that you are so innocent because you are your brother's keeper. What happens to Rwanda should be a concern for you. And do not wait when Rwanda implodes again and then stand out and say, oh, we didn't know. Today we are telling you. And we are telling you that Rwanda need not implode. But before that happens, there is work to do, and especially on the question of human rights and the question of opening up political space.
Okay, thank you. And did you
Just
have anything?
a very final word.
Yeah.
I think if you do political analysis, this is probably a little bit too optimistic an outlook, because if you look at what has piled up in terms of human rights violations, we are talking about hundreds of thousands. I was against numerical arguments, but hundreds of thousands of people. The internal dynamics, if you look at it and if you agree that it started early on during genocide, if you look at the logic of this regime, this regime came to power by talking and fighting, but more fighting than talking. It will not go out of power without fighting or being fought from inside. And actually, most of the regime change, if you also consider the colonizers, came from outside, and that's one of the scourges of Rwanda. And I'm really very much afraid that this is bound to happen again, because what has happened over the past 17 years, hundreds of thousands of Rwandans again in exile. No one works on them, not even academically. We don't know where they are. They radicalize. The only possible hope one could have, and I hope I don't contradict myself because I just want to end on a hopeful note, I see some people in exile. Mostly they talk a little bit like you now, and it becomes very difficult to somehow have a conversation with them because you end up with theories about double genocide and all that. That's the mainstream exile constituency, but there's some people who do see that the binary logic that we talked about and we started off with actually brings death and fairness to the country. And so you have a minority stream of Hutus and Tutsis who actually try to overcome it, but it's happening outside because there's no political space in Rwanda at all, and it's minority. So overall, I'm afraid, as a political analyst, not as a friend of Rwanda, and I think I'm first an analyst and second maybe see faces of Rwandans that I know, I would be very pessimistic about the outlook of this regime.
Well, thank you very much for the panel, for that very provocative discussion, and thank you to the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not good at that.